We're set to go. It's all yours, Julian.
All right. Let me just share the screen and let me do one other thing so you could see me. There we go. This way you could watch my slideshow, but at the same time see me. Play it from the start. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of that. Well, it's an honor to be here. I've never been to Hershey. I have been to many places in Pennsylvania. When I was a teenager, I worked in a summer camp just outside of Pittsburgh. So it's quite an honor to speak to you. I recently spoke at a Civil War roundtable in New York in person, and I've done talks in Washington and Chicago. I have about a half hour, 35-minute slideshow, which I hope will intrigue you. And of course, what I'm much more interested is questions and discussions from experts like yourself and people who are fascinated, as I am, with the Civil War. My topic is the name of my book, The North Star: Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln. And I want to take you through how, unbeknownst, I think, to most Americans and certainly most Canadians, how Canada became a safe haven for Confederates and really a staging ground for the South War against Lincoln. I was a history student at McGill University in the 1970s. It's kind of Canada's Harvard, studying history. And the university is right in downtown Montreal. And one day I walked a few blocks from the university, right in the middle of downtown Montreal, at the Hudson Bay Company, which is the biggest apartment chain in the country, very similar to Macy's. And there was this plaque honoring Jefferson Davis. And I remember thinking at the time, why is there a plaque honoring Jefferson Davis? And why is it still in my city, more than 100 years after the Civil War? Well, it took me 7 books and 30 years. I did books on biker gangs, the Ku Klux Klan, child abuse, until I finally had the time to write the North Star and answer that question about Jefferson Davis. Now, I think most of you, if you even think at all about Canada and the American Civil War, like most Canadians, pretty much think only of the Underground Railroad. Canada was the terminus for the Underground Railroad, made famous, with Harriet Tubman and Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's estimated about 30,000 escaped slaves made it to Canada. And once they crossed into Canada, they were free because Canada, as part of the British Empire, abolished slavery in 1834. And Martin Luther King came to Canada 1 year before, sadly, his assassination, and talked about, as you see from this quote, about deep in our history of struggle for freedom, Canada was the North Star. People knew if they followed the North Star, they would make it to freedom. That's the dominant myth. And it's a myth in the sense it's true, but it only really tells part of the story. This is what Montreal, my city, looked like in the 1860s. It was one of the biggest cities in North America, comparable to New York, 100,000 people, very modern city, a fast train ride to New York, and from there, the other cities in America. This is the political geography at the time. Canada wasn't Canada yet. It was the British North American provinces, Canada West, what we now know as Ontario, Canada East, and of course the US was divided, the Union and the Confederacy. That's what the map looked like by 1861. Now, when the war started, Lincoln and many Americans in the North hoped, assumed that the British Empire, Canada was a colony then, would support the North, the legitimate government. But in fact, Britain and therefore Canada declared its neutrality. And if you think about it, neutral is like today saying, well, we're neutral between Russia and Ukraine. We're neutral between Germany when Germany invaded Poland. Neutral means that between a legitimate democratically elected government and an illegal secessionist republic based on slavery, Canada was not going to choose sides. And what that meant is Canada would become a safe haven for Confederates and a staging ground. Now, early 1864, the war's been going on for 3 years, and the tide was turning. Jefferson Davis and the South weren't losing yet, but they weren't winning anymore. Serious battle losses, economic and political strangulation of the South. And so in early 1864, there's a secret meeting of the Confederate Parliament, and Jefferson Davis will set aside $1 million for secret services. You can see this memo in foreign countries, and almost all of that would go to Canada. He would put his Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, in charge of the Secret Service. And he would call on Jacob Thompson, who was a Washington veteran, actually knew Lincoln, was in the cabinet before the Confederacy was born. And he calls on Thompson to lead the Confederate Secret Services. Thompson will take a secret boat ride from North Carolina to Bermuda and make his way to Halifax in the east of Canada, and then eventually to Montreal. And in Montreal, he will open a bank account. This is an excerpt from his bank account. It would eventually total something like $649,000. That's the equivalent of $12 million in today's money. And we'll see in a moment how he spent that money. Now, the bank he used was a branch of the Ontario Bank in Montreal, and it was led by Henry Starnes. This was no fly-by-night operation. Henry Starnes was the bank president. He was a former mayor of Montreal. He sat in Parliament.
Where's your sound?
So he was quite prominent member of the elite. After the Lincoln assassination, when there was a military conspiracy trial, bank officials testified that they openly knew they were doing business with the Confederates. They knew Jacob Thompson. They knew he was a Confederate agent. And when asked what happened with the money, they said, and I'm quoting here, "A man doing business with us deposits what he likes. We never ask any questions. He draws checks for what he likes, and we do not know what he is going to do with it." And as I explain in my book, in fact, there's evidence that they engaged in money laundering, allowing the Confederates to take money and then send it out and change the names on the deposits and the checks. What did the Confederates do with that money? Well, let's take a look at what Thompson organized with the full knowledge of Judah Benjamin, and almost certainly in many cases, Jefferson Davis. These four men were members of Morgan's Raiders, and a lot of you may know about Morgan's Raiders, led by John Morgan. They were sort of like the Green Beret or the Navy SEALs of the Confederacy, a daring group of young cavalry officers who were able to penetrate far north than any other Confederate regiment. And these four men were all active leaders in Morgan's Raiders, and all of them would be sent by Davis to Canada to carry out operations against Lincoln and the North from Canada. One of the most famous was the New York arson attack, November 1864. John Headley leads, he's the mastermind. He goes down to New York with about a dozen of his members, easily make down to New York from Canada, and they get a valise filled with Greek fire, kind of early form of the Molotov cocktails. It was quite smelly, and there's a great scene where he's carrying this valise on a New York streetcar, and an unsuspecting woman says, "There must be something dead in that valise." It smelled like rotten eggs. Now, what the men did is they checked into 19 different hotels. Their hope was to burn down Broadway. And they openly said this was in retaliation for the scorched earth policy that the Union was carrying out in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere. They were basically saying, time for the North and Northern citizens to learn what was going on in the Civil War. Now, the mistake they made is they piled furniture and clothing in the hotel rooms, lit it on fire, but they closed the windows and the doors. So the oxygen was deprived of the fires. Many of the hotels suffered damage, but luckily nobody died. Remarkably, at the Winter Garden that very night, the three Booth brothers were on stage. The only time the three of them, most of you know, of course, John Wilkes Booth was royalty, theater royalty with his brothers, especially his more famous brother, his older brother, Edwin would play Brutus. John Wilkes would play Mark Antony and utter the famous lines, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often tarred with their bones." And as the fire breaks out, one of the brothers will actually calm down the audience, break out of character and say, don't worry, the fire is under control. The papers the next few days openly talk about it as a vast rebel conspiracy, as you can see from the headlines in the New York Times and the New York Herald. They talk about the plot originating in Canada. Everybody knew Canada was a base for what today we would call terrorism. The only member who ever got caught was Robert Cobb Kennedy. All the men made it back to Canada, but Kennedy wanted to go back to the South. And you could see from his quotes when he was interviewed during the trial, you know, he wanted to show the people of the North that there are two sides to the war. He was tried and convicted, executed. And in fact, this Canadian-based Confederate soldier was the last Confederate soldier to be executed by the United States government during the Civil War. So that's one example of what the Confederates did in Canada. Here's another example. Dr. Luke Blackburn, Kentucky man, brilliant doctor, was a doctor by the time he was a teenager, and he became a specialist in fighting yellow fever. Yellow fever would often strike the South, but also New York, all through Louisiana. He offered his services in Bermuda. Doctors didn't know how to treat yellow fever. It was almost always fatal. In Bermuda, in 1864, the nurses would notice that he would sometimes take the soiled linen and clothing of the dying and dead patients and stuff it into trunks. What he did is he was an avowed Confederate and an agent working with the Secret Services. He had 6 trunks shipped to Halifax, where he was staying when he wasn't in a hotel in Montreal, and he hired another agent to ship these 6 trunks all through the northern states. And his goal was to basically engage in bioterrorism. In a later trial, you could see the headlines. He said his goal was to cause, he hoped, thousands of deaths all through the North. He even tried to send some of the infected clothing to the White House. Now, what Blackburn and nobody at the time knew, was only discovered in 1901, is that yellow fever is caused by mosquitoes, not by infected clothing. But at the time, both the Confederates and the North saw it for what it was, really an early form of bioterrorism. And so another example of Canada being in the headlines as a haven for a kind of Confederate terror activity across the border. Perhaps the most famous example of what the Confederate agents did was the raid on St. Albans, led by a very charismatic young Confederate named Bennett Young. I live in Montreal, and when we go skiing in Vermont, St. Albans is the first town you cross when you cross the border. And back then, it was also just a few hours ride by horse. So Bennett Young and about a dozen other Confederates come into St. Albans dressed as Canadian tourists. Bennett Young charms the governor and the governor's wife. He was a a religious student. And at 3 o'clock one afternoon, he steps outside the hotel, announces to the town by firing off a gun that he's taking over the town in the name of the Confederacy. Within 15 minutes, they will rob 3 banks, steal over $250,000 back then, worth millions today, kill one innocent bystander, and then skedaddle out of town. Now, they're quickly arrested. This makes huge headlines, as you can imagine. And many towns in the north now fear that they will be subject to future attacks. This is a picture of them outside the Montreal jail. And if you ever come to Montreal, I organized Civil War tours. And this jail still looks exactly like this, right at the foot of the St. Lawrence River. They called the jail, it was the chief jailer was called Louis Payette, and Bennett Young called it Payette's Hotel. You could see how well they were treated. They would have white linen tablecloths and fine wine. The New York Times and other papers reported how all the fine ladies and the elites would come by the jail to dine and party with the St. Albans Raiders. Bennett Young boasts that he had an affair with the judge's daughter. They were defended in court by none other than John Abbott, the dean of the McGill Law School. They had friends in high places. The police chief, Guillaume Lamotte, as I reveal in the book, meets secretly with one of the other Confederate agents who's organizing the defense. He will arrange, he is given $90,000, which is all they found on the bank robbers. The judge hands over the money, he says, to safekeeping to Guillaume Lamotte. Lamotte will hand it over to the Confederates, who will store it in which bank? The Ontario Bank. Judge Courceau, whose daughter is having an affair with the Confederates, will throw out the case on a technicality. He will later be accused of malfeasance in a judicial investigation. The Confederates steal the money a second time the minute they're acquitted, rush to the bank, grab the money, and escape. Some of them will be rearrested, but they will be acquitted another time. And as you can see in the New York Times and in other newspapers, there is outrage once again against Canada. In fact, President Lincoln, in what nobody knew at the time, but what would become his last State of the Union address, would criticize in diplomatic terms what Canada had become, this haven for Confederates, and he would impose something we still have today, passports, in order for Canadians to make it into Canada. So you could see the various terror activities that the Confederates carried out. And what's important to understand is they didn't do this secretly. This wasn't done, in the dark shadows of Aldi's. This was openly reported in newspapers, and the elites in Canada tended to support the South. Political leaders, church leaders, business leaders. John A. Macdonald is Canada's George Washington, the founder of Canada. Canada would become Canada in 1867, just after the Civil War. And in 1864, in one of the conferences to create Canada, he spoke of the gallant defense that is being made by the Southern Republic. At this moment, they have not much more than 4 millions of men, and yet what a brave fight they have made. And keep in mind, this is late in 1864, when by now it is clear the Civil War is a battle over slavery. We talked about John Abbott, the prominent lawyer who defended the St. Albans Raiders. He would become Canada's third prime minister. Most of the newspapers in Canada, the overwhelming majority, French and English, were anti-Lincoln. La Monnaie, the main French newspaper, had no shame in praising the Confederacy for fielding the most intelligent armies we have known in America. The Niagara Review in Ontario denounced Lincoln as a mad, blood-stained despot at Washington. The Montreal Gazette in my hometown talked about white men who are planters who need to preserve their lives and property. And this is how they described the Emancipation Proclamation: little more than an indecent exposure of Lincoln's rage and fiendishness. So again, think about this for a moment. Canada is seen as more liberal than the United States. Canadians pride themselves on supposedly being less racist than many other countries. And yet, here we have our main newspapers denouncing the Emancipation Proclamation. The English and French Catholic Church opposed Lincoln. Archbishop Thomas Connolly meets with many Confederate agents in Halifax and sends a note to all his followers urging them to support the Confederacy. We'll talk about the French church a little later. This man, George Taylor Denison III, one of the richest men in Toronto, has a huge estate modeled after a southern villa called the Hayden Villa. He would become friends with Jefferson Davis, Robert Lee, Jubal Early. He would visit with Davis and Lee, and he would allow his villa to be used as a hiding place for Confederate agents. He gives them money, helps them to get passports. Why did the elites in Canada back the South? There were several reasons. It didn't mean necessarily that they were strong advocates of slavery. Canada didn't have slavery. There was an economic reason. The elites in Canada were tied to the elites in Britain. 80% of Britain's cotton came from the South. Also, you could make a fortune running the blockade. Think of it as getting around the Russian sanctions that we have right now. If you could do business with Russia, you could make a fortune. So we saw how through Halifax and other towns, businessmen would engage in trade with the South. There was also a class factor. Many Southern aristocrats would flee the South, much like Russia's oligarchs have fled Moscow and set up in London and New York. Well, the Canadian aristocrats felt quite at home all through Southern Ontario, around Niagara Falls. There were these comfortable homes where leading Confederate generals, military leaders, political leaders, businessmen would hobnob with Canadian aristocrats. The only Northerners that would come from Canada would often be draft dodgers, not at all the same class of the elite. And finally, there was politics, because frankly, there were many members of Lincoln's cabinet and in the press who openly talked of annexation or invasion. And so many members of the elite were worried that if the North won the Civil War, they would then turn their attention to Canada. So that's some of the reasons why the elites in Canada backed the South. But it meant that Canada played a very hidden but very ugly role in the Civil War. Now, while the elites tended to support the South, many ordinary Canadians backed the Union. Lieutenant Edward Doherty was typical of many of the 30 to 50,000 English and French Canadians who enlisted in the Civil War, overwhelmingly on the Union side. In fact, 5 to 10% of some regiments in Maine, Massachusetts, and Michigan were Francophones. 29 Canadians earned Medal of Honors. 5 of them became Union generals, and several thousand died. My book talks a lot about these two pioneering Black doctors. Alexander Augusta was an American born as a free Black, but could not get into medical school because of discrimination in America. So he goes to Toronto. He graduates, becomes Canada's first Black doctor, and he will mentor Dr. Anderson Abbott, who becomes Canada's first native-born Black doctor. Both his parents were American free Blacks who flee the racism and oppression in Alabama and settle in Canada. Now, both these men will join several thousand Black Canadians. You can see this recruitment poster who will fight in the South. I just rewatched the movie Glory, in which Denzel Washington won the Academy Award. 4 of the Black soldiers who would die in their famous battle came from Canada. This is the letter. A very little known part of the Emancipation Proclamation is when Lincoln opens up the army to Black men. And right after that, Abbott and Augusta write to the Lincoln administration offering their services. They are both accepted in the army. What happens to Augusta is quite remarkable, as the New York Times reports. He shows up in Washington for his interview, and the medical board sees this Black man with a letter. They assume it's the manservant who is carrying the official letters for the doctor. And when he walks in and they realize he's the doctor, they refuse to accept him. And the Lincoln government has to overrule them and says, no, 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 you will accept him. And in fact, Augusta, who will also at one point be mobbed by Baltimore secessionists in full uniform, and will rise to become the highest ranking Black officer in the Union Army. Alexander Abbott will become a famous doctor as well, fighting for civil rights. And one evening in 1865, both men will crash a party at the White House. Lincoln would hold levees, and as Abbott recounts and newspapers account, they come into the White House dressed in their full uniform, two handsome Black soldiers, mouths are agape, but Lincoln will shake their hands. And after the assassination, Mary Lincoln will give the Canadian doctor one of Lincoln's shawls. This woman, Emma Edmonds, was one of the most famous women in the Union Army. She was a young girl in New Brunswick who chafed at restrictions, disguises herself as a man to become a bookseller, and will then join the Union Army for 2 years. Fighting as both a nurse and as a mail carrier. And 30 years after the war, with the help of her fellow male soldiers, she reveals who she is, and Congress will pass a bill because she later deserts under the name of the man she pretended to be. They remove her status as a deserter and pay her pension. So you can see how the American Civil War divided Canada, much as it did the U.S. Now, as the war dragged on, the South is losing, and Montreal becomes a hotbed of Confederate conspiracies. And who shows up in Montreal in the fall of 1864? John Wilkes Booth. Like other Confederates, he'll come to Montreal St. Lawrence Hall. This building still exists in Montreal. It was one of the finest hotels in North America. It boasted a dining saloon, a concert room, hot and cold baths. This was the reading room and dining lounge. John Wilkes Booth signs in under his own name, as you could see, on October 18th, 1864, just as the St. Albans raid is getting underway. And according to accounts, he would throw pennies at the newspaper boys and read the newspaper accounts of the daring Confederate raid. He will do banking. Where else? Of course, at the Ontario Bank, run by Henry Starnes. This is the bank draft he will take out for about 300 US dollars. And he asks the bank, I'm going to be running the blockade. Will that be okay? And the bank, according to later testimony in Washington, assures him, yes, 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 only you could use this money. So they openly know what Booth is going to use the money for. Now, I like to say that if Montreal was the Casablanca of the Civil War, Dooley's Bar was Rick's Cafe. This was the entrance to Dooley's Bar, where John Wilkes Booth would play pool with a Quebec billiard champion. And later, Joseph Dion, that champion, would recount these chilling words that John Wilkes Booth would say during the night. He said the elections were coming up in November for Lincoln's reelection. And he said it made damn little difference, head or tail. Abe's contract was nearly up. Whether reelected or not, he would get his goose cooked. And of course, those words took on a chilling resonance just a few months later. Booth, of course, would assassinate Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. And just look at how some of the Canadian newspapers recounted that assassination. the London Examiner said, as atrocious as was Booth's deed, it was literally justified by the facts. The man he killed had murdered the Constitution of the United States. Um, so you can see how many Canadian newspapers blamed Lincoln and justified his assassination. Now, on a Monday morning, Montrealer Edward Doherty, who had risen through the ranks, was sitting in Lafayette Park opposite the White House. He gets a written order to report to the War Department, and he is assigned to head the military regiment that is tasked with hunting down the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, and his associate, David Harold, along with two Union detectives. I write about Edward Doherty's role in a cover issue of Canada's history. Booth, as you of course know, rides off in the night. He will when he's in Montreal, he will get two letters of introduction to members of the Maryland Underground, which he will use to eventually escape, make his way all the way to Garrett Farm, where Doherty and his men will surround him in the barn. The barn is set fire. David Harold is taken out. Booth goes down fighting, is shot, of course, and killed. And as he's dying on the porch with Edward Doherty and others, what do they find in his back pocket but that bank draft that he had taken out in Montreal, signed by the former mayor of Montreal, uh, John Starnes. So Henry Starnes. So you could see how you have a Montrealer helping to lead the hunt for Booth. And on Booth's dying body, we find a bank draft from a Canadian bank. Now, of course, right after the assassination, there is a major trial. The North and the administration was determined to try to prove unsuccessfully that the whole assassination was plotted not just by Booth, but by the leaders of the Confederacy and especially the Secret Service in Canada. There's no evidence that any of them directly met with Booth, except for one man, George Sanders. But this was the front page of the New York Times when the proclamation is issued. And as you could see, Mr. Lincoln's murder planned by leading traitors. Most of these traitors are harbored in Canada. In fact, of the 5 people mentioned, 4 of them were in Canada, and George Sanders had met with Booth and talked with him several times in secret. Now, as you know, 4 of the conspirators are hung, but one of them is still missing and on the run, John Surratt. In fact, the day after the assassination, the Canadian newspaper, The Globe, talks about Booth and Surratt are the assassins. That's wrong. Surratt, of course, was not there, but he was known as a close friend of Booth. And the newspapers at the time reported they are supposed to be escaping to Canada. Well, of course, as we know, Booth was headed south, but Surratt did go to Canada. He hid out, of course, where else? In St. Lawrence Hall. He writes home how he's admiring the Basilica, the Notre Dame Basilica, which is still there, looks just like that right near the hotel. But it's decided it's unsafe for him to stay. So with the help of the Catholic Church and 2 prominent priests, he will hide out in the Quebec countryside for 2 months, several months, including this small little town of Saint-Liboire. And when that becomes too dangerous, he eventually makes it back to Montreal. And with the help of the Catholic Church, who will send a recommendation, he will join the Pope's private army in Italy as a Zouave until he will eventually be captured, sent home for trial, in which, of course, he would be acquitted. What about Jefferson Davis? He'd spent 2 years in jail. He gets bail in 1864. Where will he flee? Will he go to Memphis, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama? Nope. He goes straight to Montreal. He takes a train that night to New York, then goes to Montreal, where his family is already staying. He will initially of course, their plans are that he would stay at the St. Lawrence Hall, but instead, for a short period of time, he is put up at the stately mansion of John Lovell, one of the leading publishers in Canada, who had published a lot of Confederate propaganda. And where was John Lovell's house? John Lovell's house was at the building that eventually became the Hudson Bay Company. And that's why this plaque, written in French, but put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, says, to the memory of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States, who in 1867 stayed here at John Lovell's house. And so 50 years after I saw that plaque, I was able to understand why that plaque was there and the role that Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederates played. Jefferson Davis had a wonderful time in Montreal. He goes to Montreal's Théâtre Royal, and when people recognize him, the crowd stops. The band breaks out into Dixie. 3 cheers are given to him. People cry out, "Long live the South." Think about this. This could not have happened in New York or Boston, or Hershey or Pittsburgh, but it happens in Montreal. Davis will do a kind of victory tour all through Ontario, get his official picture taken in Montreal. And in a speech he makes, and these are his words, very truthful, he says, "May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now an asylum for myself." And he's right. Canada was an asylum for him and for many of the Confederates. Let's end with the famous Lost Cause. As you know, the Lost Cause was the very successful attempt. Usually victors get to write history, but not in the case of the Civil War. In many ways, the Confederates got to write history, and they continued to try to whitewash and glorify the South. Remember our good friend who was called Dr. Death, the Dr. Luke Blackburn of the Yellow Fever plot? Well, he will return to Kentucky, and be elected as governor. During the race, some of the northern newspapers would say, "Wait a minute, that's the guy who was accused of being behind the Yellow Fever plot." And in a kind of mood very similar to today, Mr. Dr. Blackburn and his supporters dismissed that as fake news and said, "Well, what's the real proof that he was ever in Canada?" He becomes a very beloved governor of Kentucky. Remember Bennett Young, the leader of St. Albans Raid? In 1914, he becomes a leader of the Confederate veteran groups, and he will be the keynote speaker along with President Wilson to commemorate a giant statue for Confederate soldiers in Arlington Cemetery, which openly talks about the Lost Cause. And that statue, if you could read in this inscription, is put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the same group that put up the plaque in Montreal. There was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, about the Klan, and Gone with the Wind, all examples of the Lost Cause. Now, as some Confederate statues and monuments began to come down in America, I called my daughter, who was working at the newsroom of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Montreal. I was working in Toronto at the time. And I told her, "You should check out that plaque that I used to see as a student at McGill to Jefferson Davis." Well, journalists did. And that very day, they discovered that the United Daughters had put up that plaque, and the plaque gets taken down in August 2017. I actually think they should keep the plaque up and use it as a teachable moment and put an explanation plaque over it. But it just shows how the ghosts of the Confederacy are still with us. Interestingly enough, 2 new plaques are going up to honor those 2 Black doctors that we talked about. And that is much more fitting. There's a famous saying by William Faulkner, the Southern writer: "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Those are the words that Barack Obama invoked when he was running for president. And of course, Abraham Lincoln said that history is not history unless it is the truth. Now, finally, in 2023, the Montreal Gazette put this on their front page. Remember, they had justified Lincoln's assassination, but on their front page, they had a story plotting against Lincoln, and it revealed Canada's spy history. The story was written by me. With excerpts from my book. So I'm glad that 150 years later, my hometown newspaper finally got it right. You can find out much more about the book. This is the hardcover edition, and a new paperback edition will be out in April. But if you go to my website, just my name, juliansher.com, North Star, you can find lots of videos, interviews I've done on radio stations, lots of videos from talks I've given like this all across the United States, and lots of newspaper articles. Okay. I've taken away they stopped sharing. So let's get to the much more interesting part of the evening, your questions and comments.
Yeah, like anybody, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, Julian, good program. Lots of neat information that you were able to share with us. So well done. You mentioned about the Canadians, pretty free travel between Montreal and some of the other cities into the U.S. And you mentioned that most of the Canadians favored the Union. The South did continue trade with England and Canada because of the cotton, but did other trade, normal trade, still maintained between Canada and the United States, much like we have today? I mean, we got your Tim Hortons, but and then you
Right.
build lots of cars for us too, and send them to the United States, and they're all well made. Was that maintained during the war too?
Yes. No, Canada was neutral. So the trade between Canada and the North was quite strong. There was huge amount of commercial exchanges, Chicago and the St. Lawrence Seaway. The South, as you know, was under an economic blockade. Technically, of course, the North couldn't trade with the South, but also the blockade was a sea blockade. And that was an attempt to strangle the South, much like the US is trying to strangle Putin's Russia. But of course, Britain and other countries would try to secretly violate the blockade. Halifax became a flourishing center of blockade runners, which would ship not just cotton, but all kinds, because what did the South need, right? They needed ammunition, they needed metal, they needed all kinds of equipment. So many Halifax business people became rich, breaking the blockade. The British shipyards and also the Halifax shipyards would repair Navy ships from the Confederates. Confederate companies and the Confederacy itself would trade on the British Stock Exchange. So that's what being neutral meant, right? You could profit from both sides, right? You could sell to Lincoln and you could sell to Davis and his Confederacy.
Well done. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? Go ahead. Speak out. Like I say, just unmute yourself, then ask away.
No, it was just, to me, it was just really, really good. Thank you.
I'm
wondering if you can hear me. My name's Tony Rose.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentation. A couple questions for you, if you can clarify some information that I've been researching. So Booth meets Patrick Martin up in Canada as well, I would assume, because
Correct.
Patrick Martin
Correct.
supposedly is the one who gives him the letters. And
That's right.
And I think Booth tasks him with mailing his trunk of costumes and acting gear south.
Correct.
Why was Patrick Martin up there? Was he part of the group that went up there, or did he just happen to be there staying at the St. Lawrence?
Well, Patrick Martin was a well-known Confederate agent. He wasn't necessarily part of the Secret Service. He was there before Thompson arrived. There were quite a
Okay.
few, right from the beginning of the war, many Confederates moved up there. He was a blockade runner. We were just talking about that. He made
Yeah.
his money getting around the blockade, but he was a known Confederate sympathizer. And as you point out, Booth knows him, goes directly to his house, will actually spend time at his house. Patrick Martin is the man
You
who will
like it
go
that way.
with Booth to the Ontario Bank to do the banking. Patrick Martin will give him those 2 letters of introduction. Now, Booth had always said that the main reason he's going to Montreal is to ship his acting gear to the South and get around the blockade. And it's Patrick Martin who will do the shipping. Ironically, the ship will be shipwrecked, and Booth's clothing and Patrick Martin are forever lost in the ocean. But as many Lincoln scholars have pointed out, it doesn't take 2 weeks to pack your clothes and ship them to the South. So Booth
Right.
was clearly in Montreal for other reasons than packing his clothes.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up then?
For sure.
In doing a little bit of research, I found that Jacob Thompson met with Clement Vallandigham.
Yes.
It is, and Vallandigham wanted reunion through peace. He was kicked out of the United States. The South didn't want him, so he goes to Halifax because he wants to try to get back into Ohio. What did he have? Was he coerced? What was his take on what the Confederates were doing in Canada?
Well, I have a whole chapter on him, and for time constraints,
Okay.
I don't go into that. But it's in addition to the terrorist plots that we talked about, the arson in New York, the St. Albans attack. There were the bioterrorism, yellow fever plot. There were also plots, naval plots on the Great Lakes, attempts to piracy, but there was also political interference. So, as the speaker was just raising, Clement Vallandigham was a real thorn in the side of Lincoln. He was basically, people would basically call him a capitulator. He wanted the North to sign a peace agreement and basically end the war and give the Confederacy what it wanted. Lincoln was so upset with him, he basically has him arrested and then bans him and ships him to the Confederacy. Well, Clement will then sneak his way into Canada, is treated, those politicians I showed you about, will be treated as a welcome guest in Canada's parliament, and then meets with Jacob Thompson, and they will secretly plan what is called the Northwest Conspiracy. Thompson will give him money, and Clement becomes a leader of a kind of underground group that promises to lead an armed revolt in the Northwest states against Lincoln. And they plot during the Democratic Convention. The plot is that Clement will win the nomination in Chicago and force the Democratic Party to sign a peace or capitulation agreement with the South. And at the same time, Jacob Thompson sends some of the soldiers from Morgan's Raiders, and they will break into the prisons in Chicago and elsewhere and start a revolution in the Northwest states and topple all the Northwest governors. So it was quite a complicated plot. It comes to naught. Clement doesn't win in Chicago. McClellan will win and will not follow a capitulation line. McClellan, of course, will lose to Lincoln, and the attacks on the prisons fizzle out. But it's a good example of how important the Canadian Secret Services were at the highest levels of the political conspiracies against Lincoln.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
And just a side note, Tony is with Barbara Kaufman is going to be talking about the Lincoln conspiracy in September. So be prepared for some more Lincoln assassination information. You don't have to pay me for that buzz, Tony.
I was going to say, thanks for the plug.
You will.
Shameless plug.
Yeah, there you go. Any other questions anybody has for Julian?
Ricky, can I ask one?
Oh, go right ahead, Mike. Please do.
Sure. Thank you, Julian. I've seen letters from John MacDonald, late 1860s, to Civil War generals in the United States. He's very curious about the history of the war. He seems quite knowledgeable, like he followed it closely. I wonder if did a separate Civil War historiography develop in Canada? Because one of the things I noticed is your description of the kind of self-congratulation Canadians extend themselves about being the
Yes.
terminus of the Underground Railroad. Northern United States citizens kind of do the same thing.
That's right. That's right. And as you know, you're right. Northerners like to say, well, we were much better than the South. But of course, my book talks an example of the New York draft riots, right? When Lincoln decides to extend the draft, the Civil War was very unpopular in New York, especially among the working class Irish, who were forced to go to war while the rich could buy their way out of the army. There's a huge riot in New York when the draft is announced. It's basically seen as the biggest race riot in American history. Blacks are lynched in New York, and black orphanages are burned because people in New York opposed Lincoln and what he was doing in the Civil War. So you're right. And in Canada, too, we have a very kind of congratulatory pat on the back. There were only, there's my book, of course, which I am proud to say has caused a bit of a stir. And among historians, there were at least, and I cite them all in my book, 2 or 3 other books written by Canadian historians that explore some of the same area that I do. But it's largely, I never knew about it. I studied history in university. I studied Canadian history, and none of this was ever in our history books. It was always, we were the Underground Railway, all of which is true. I mean, it's very important. Harper's Ferry was planned in Canada. Uncle Tom's Cabin, despite its rather demeaning depictions, talked quite favorably about Canada being that North Star. Frederick Douglass calls his newspaper the North Star out of Rochester. So it's an important, true part that Canada played. But what I think has been hidden from most Canadians and Americans is the role that Canadian elites played. And you saw that through the newspapers. Now, what's good about, to your point, the fact that the Montreal Gazette would run a long feature that exposed their own newspaper and its role in the Civil War was good, right? And the good thing about most Canadians is they're willing to confront their past. So I think that that's good, and I hope this will lead to more debate and discussion in the north of the United States and in Canada, because in the end, I've written many books, and my books cover different topics, but there's always a hidden theme. So obviously, this book is about the Civil War and Lincoln, but the theme, I like to say, and I explore it in the opening pages of the book, is about choices. We all have to make choices. You have to make choices about the war in Ukraine. You have to make choices about poverty, whatever. Everybody has to make choices. Obviously, you make choices in your life, who you're going to marry, and how you're going to raise your kids. But when there's a big crisis, you have to make choices. And this book is about everybody made certain choices. Nobody forced Edward Doherty to join the army. It wasn't his war. It wasn't his country. Yet he joins the Union Army and will lead the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. Those black doctors fought for freedom, but could have stayed quite comfortably in Toronto, and yet they make a decision. And Emma Thompson, almost changes her gender, right? Becomes a man to fight. And yet the Canadian bankers and John A. Macdonald and many publishers made a conscious choice And it was conscious because the abolitionist movement was very strong in Canada. I'll give you an example. The Fugitive Slave Act, as you know, passed in 1850, and Lincoln kept it on the books, meant that it was a crime for anybody in the North or anywhere to help a slave escape. Well, when slaves escaped to Canada, they were often hunted down by Southern slave catchers, and one of them was revealed to have killed the master when he escaped. And there were attempts to extradite him, and there were huge protest rallies in Canada, and Canada in the end refused to extradite him. So the point is people clearly decided, am I going to be an abolitionist or am I going to support the South? It was not a choice you had if you were in the South, or if you were in the Union Army. But in Canada, we had that choice. And unfortunately, many people in the elites chose to go with the South. So that's what the book is about. It's about choices. So I hope, if you read the book, you'll see how those choices were made at very key moments.
Excellent. Okay. Anybody else have any questions, comments? Besides, I recommend everybody buy Julian's book. He's got us leading into it. So anybody else have anything for the group? If not, just a quick one, let you know, next month, February the 15th, will be a Zoom. It'll be by Bob O'Brien. He's going to talk about Jack Henson, the legendary and most wanted Civil War sniper. So another change in the subject. So again, Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you. You go to, as I said, you can go to my website to find out more. You can email me anytime. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. Keep in touch. I hope maybe to come to the Gettysburg Conference, the Lincoln Conference next fall. If I get invited as a speaker, I will be in Washington and other places speaking. So just keep tabs on my website for any announcements, and please email me, reach out anytime. I'd be glad to answer your questions.
Okay, appreciate it.
Thank you for the invite. Stay safe, everyone. Okay.
Okay. Again, thank you guys everybody, and we'll definitely keep in touch, Julian. And with that, we'll say goodnight and see you all next month.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Julian. Fantastic job.